Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 5 for Intro to Art. This lecture, we're going to be covering line. Um, Hopefully, you're actually going to watch this before the project. Keep in mind contour lines. We'll be covering that in this lecture, and I believe the project for next week will be on that. So, this lecture will probably be slightly less interesting since I won't have everybody in class in front of me to inspire me to go off on all sorts of crazy tangents. So I'll just be kind of reading through the information on the slides, and this is like the second time I've tried to record these things, so bear with me. I think I got it all set, and yeah, here we go. Line. So to start with, we're going to be looking at one of my favorite artists. We've looked at some similar works. I can't remember if we've looked at works specifically by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Some of you may have heard the Bauhaus mentioned, and oftentimes it's within reference to Kandinsky, but Moholy-Nagy was kind of actually a little bit more active in terms of doing the layout for the books and kind of, I don't know, when I think about Bauhaus philosophy, I'm actually imagining his works rather than Kandinsky or Paul Klee or Gropius. These are all just names, but maybe at some point in your life you'll come across these again. But so for line, we are looking at some pure line work here, right? And we should be seeing kind of right off the bat that there's a little bit of, what would you say, gray area, appropriate with this piece, between what is strictly a line and then when a line becomes a form. There's a classic book by Kandinsky that's point and line to plane, right? So once you connect enough lines, all of a sudden you have a three-dimensional form. So again, there's not like hard and fast definitions. It's kind of a gradient between concepts, but a line is very simple, right? We use them all the time in writing, but it also can be complicated. So I will do my best not to overcomplicate this whole thing. All right. So, yeah. So this lecture, we're looking at line, which is fundamental to visual art. It's the backbone for artistic expression. It helps guide our eyes, shapes our perceptions, and also is able to convey emotions. Just a single line, single brushstroke can make you feel something. So in this lecture, we're going to look at various types of lines, how they function, what they express, and we'll be looking at some art along the way. So let's try to understand line. It can be defined as an infinite series of points arranged in a direction, which again, I think this kind of is probably more complicated than it needs to be. But yes, a line is just a series of points. Or if you think of it like with those time-lapse images, if you move a single point, right, and you just track its entire movement, you create a line. It can be curved and or straight and exist in various forms in different mediums, right? So it's not just line on a paper. I do a lot of incised lines into clay. When you think of like stained glass windows, right? People have to score a line and then they break across it. So yeah, very useful. They can be defined as rectilinear, geometric, or inorganic. Straight lines can be rectilinear, geometric, or inorganic. These are all kind of overlapping concepts. Curved lines can be curvilinear or organic. But perfectly curved lines, so like if you're using a compass, those would be considered geometric and inorganic. So not perfectly clear. So if your curved line is too perfectly curved, then it's no longer an organic line. There you go. So yeah, if you think of like architectural drafting, right? If you're using a ruler and a compass and that kind of stuff, then we're in the realm of inorganic. You need the imperfections to be organic. So lines are not just physical marks. They are tools that artists use to define shapes, create movement, and express emotions. So we're starting here. Empire State Building, pretty iconic. This is an expression of a geometric line. and geometric lines are related to perfect mathematical shapes and man-made objects. Again, this is not, I wouldn't say this is actually quite man-made as much as it's machine-made objects. But again, that is kind of man-made. They're straight, regular, and uniform, and they'll follow a specific pattern. They can be symmetrical or repeat kind of asymmetrically in a different way, but there is always this rhythm. We also saw this when we were looking at the Parthenon, the Greek temple, and then also the White House in Washington, D.C. The Capitol building is the same kind of thing. Straight lines, repetition, columns do this. So Empire State Building is Art Deco design, and again, we haven't covered that, but it's just something to know. And it's all straight lines, all vertical and horizontal lines. So we just have different expressions of line between the window and the space in between, and then the building itself. So just lines, lines, and lines. Yes, and the verticality of the lines then emphasize the verticality of the structure itself, making it appear even larger than it already does, or feel larger, right? So then the horizontal lines also give that sense of stability, right? It's very grounded, a little bit wider on the bottom, tapers up. You can say a lot with just vertical and horizontal lines. So here we've got an early Mondrian painting, and this is made entirely of geometric lines and blocks of color. These, because they're a little bit more freeform, most everything that Mondrian did, even the later ones that are very rigid in structure, were done without the use of a ruler. So this is all straight lines, but they have somewhat of an organic quality to them, right? So again, we're already in kind of a gray area, kind of appropriate that we're using grays and muted tones in this painting. So this is somewhat random and faded and gives this push and pull where we're kind of dissolving out to the edge. And yeah, it feels more organic than you would expect from something that's really just all geometric form, right? So even geometry can be organic, and organic can also feel kind of geometric. So there you go. And we kind of feel that with this piece, right? So we're moving on to organic lines now. And so organic lines appear natural and imperfect rather than being man-made, mathematical, or mechanical. They have less structure. They change quickly. They don't follow a set path or a route. They can be curved and irregular. However, I feel with this piece that actually, even though they're all floral designs and it's supposed to be very natural and organic, they also don't really feel organic. Like, this is a very structured work of art here. Even the flowing of the clothing isn't really natural. It all feels a little bit deliberate. So this is Art Nouveau. This is a movement that was right before and kind of overlapped with the Art Deco. So the rigid geometry of Art Deco, kind of a response to this flowing naturalism of Art Nouveau. So Alphonse Mucha in this piece uses organic lines to suggest these delicate forms. And so organic lines kind of give that sense of flowing, make fabrics feel soft, make flowers feel more natural, right? And that's kind of my issue with this piece, is it's almost too perfect. Like, there's too much math for it to actually feel natural. But that being said, it's a great piece of art. So we have all these swirling, moving organic forms, and this then contrasts with this white circle in the back. So that kind of stabilizes the whole thing. Again, it's that unity and variety, rhythm, repetition, all these things going on. So another example of Art Nouveau, and this is just all organic lines here. The font at the top, the hair kind of flowing into the background pattern, the flow of the clothing. I think really the only straight line you have is maybe on the side of this bottle. And this is an ad for salad dressing, which is just kind of awesome. So they're really playing up the expressivity of these organic lines. And so the hair and the clothing flow together, swirl around, filling the entire composition. And then this is repeated in the lettering, right? Everything is moving here and bringing us back around to the product and the name of the product, right? It definitely feels very natural, very sensual, right? Um, nothing about this feels mechanical, right? So here on the left, we have a kind of prime example of representational art, right? And this is an etching, and on the right hand side, we have again another piece by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, which is a kind of prime example of abstract, or really this is non-objective art, and yet both of them are making use of both organic and inorganic lines, right? They're straight lines and curved lines, and it's the interplay of these things that gives movement and life to the composition. And interestingly enough, we have horizontal lines in the background of the piece on the left, giving this horizontal movement. Motion lines, if anybody's watched, cartoons, anime, you see these things a lot. And then Moholy-Nagy is doing the same thing vertically, right, to give us this upward motion in his composition on the right. And then that, of course, is contrasted by these curving lines moving horizontally and diagonally throughout the composition. So abstract art is not by definition inorganic, and representational art is not by definition organic. And we're going to circle back to this piece on the left later in the lecture. So there are several types of line, and they all have distinct purposes, and we're going to go through each one of them, but here's just an overview. We've got contour lines, actual lines. Actual lines like a weird category. It's just literally a line connecting two dots. So it's almost so simple as to be useless in terms of definitions. But anyways, we have implied lines. I've kind of brought this up a little bit in lectures. Leading lines, directional lines, we've definitely talked about this in some of our discussions of artworks. And communicative and expressive lines, right? And so that's kind of getting to that essence of the fact that you can communicate thoughts and emotions with just a line. All right. So contour lines, very simple, right? They are the outlines. They outline shapes and figures. They give a sense of form and structure. They define the edges of objects. They create a visual boundary that guides the viewer's understanding of the composition. Contour lines can also be used to show key details in a shape or form, right? So Manet and then Matisse is another artist that educators are constantly referring to for these contour lines, right? Because we have a very simple composition that communicates a whole lot right here. And so this is really just contour line. Of course, there's a little bit more going on in the hair with a little bit of shading, but it's really almost a single line, going around the entire composition. Very little for the eyes, nose, and mouth, and yet we can easily read this. And if we look at it, next to a picture of Bert Morisot, then we can actually see that it's a very realistic rendering, right? So by varying the thickness, Manet is able to communicate, different elements of this composition. So this thick single outline brings the subject together, and the finer lines show the shape of the hair, and we even get these, like, the sense of the individual wisps of hair coming out. So again, like, art doesn't have to be complicated to be great. And yes, these more thick lines are bringing us into the eyes, and then these thin lines are for the nose and mouth, and that feels soft and fine. So just varying the thickness of a line, you're able to convey someone's personality, right, in a moment in time. Aubrey Beardsley one of the greats, kind of definitely more Art Nouveau. I think also falls in maybe art historically more into the Art Deco category, even though it is more Nouveau. A lot more flowing lines. But here we have a really great use of contour lines. And so we have these simple outlines of the hands and arms. It's just, a single line. And yet we can see the gesture for this figure on the right. And yet some of the other lines are much more expressive, right? With all this clothing, we feel movement throughout this skirt. So we get both form and even in the clothing, the pleats, all that kind of stuff, there's a sense of texture and movement just with the simple line. So actual lines, this again, it's just a physically present line that connects two or more points. Very simple, but again, it's kind of ambiguous because it's so simple. So the famous painting, The Scream by Edvard Munch, there was also a lithograph, right? And these are really heavy lines here. Everything is lined. There's not really any shading. So we have a heavy contour line outlining the figure and the bridge, and the movement in the sky. It's just all really thick lines, right? There's no shading. So only actual lines are used to show texture and figure and landscape and everything. So, and there is a variety in terms of thickness in lines, which does give us a little bit of movement and a sense of depth. This is a really fascinating work of art. So this is like somewhat of a performance piece, somewhat photography, somewhat conceptual. So very contemporary work by Richard Long. It's called A Line Made by Walking. And so this artist would literally just walk back and forth and create this beaten path throughout nature, and would then go and photograph it. So it's really showing the physicality of line, right? How it's literally an impression in the earth. But then, this landscape, both of them, but the one on the right, it's just wild how it's able to break apart the composition and how it just contrasts with the curving forms of the mountains and this dried arroyo kind of slithering through the composition. It really, with a very simple process, completely changes one's perception of landscape. And also, by putting it right down the middle, it's like you can't avoid this line in the composition. Very powerful piece here. All right, so implied lines. These are lines that are not physically drawn, but are suggested through the alignment of shapes or the direction of figures in a composition, right? So they're not actually there, but they're there, right? So in this sand dune piece by Plains Galagadi, it's a photograph, right? But the colors here, right, are unavoidable. And so we have this bright orange, and then the kind of muted yellow of the midground of the landscape, and everything then contrasting with the blue of the sky, right? And so it's really just like yellow, blue, really orange, blue, and then this muted yellow. And there's no actual lines here, right? This is nature, but there is a sense of line that moves us through the piece, right? So there's also a change in texture going on here as well. So these lines are implied through the composition. And this is a great one. This is like the peak example, the iconic example of an implied line. So I brought this up in class, right? If somebody's pointing at something, you're going to follow the direction of that hand. And if somebody's looking at something, you're going to follow that gaze, right? So you don't necessarily even need a line, right? I mean, the hand, the finger pointing is a line. And there's the line of the stare, of the gaze, right? So in the Virgin of the Rocks by Leonardo da Vinci, we get caught up in this cycle of movement through these gestures and gazes and these four figures. So, again, implied lines are not actually drawn, but we kind of figuratively and literally connect the dots, and these lines exist in our minds, right? So this image has now drawn these implied lines for you. These are also known as sight lines, and because they're really the line of sight for these figures. And painters will use this to emphasize, right? To remember, we talked about emphasis, right? To emphasize certain aspects of the composition, and it also creates movement, so really important. As we follow the gazes, they look and point in one another. So the angel, which is in the red cape to the right, looks at the viewer, kind of past the viewer, and is pointing at the infant John the Baptist at the left. John the Baptist is looking at the infant Jesus, who in turn looks back again at him. So these two children, right? Jesus is the one in the bottom right by the angel. They're looking back and forth, so we get caught in this gaze here. But then we have Mary above looking down at Jesus and gesturing towards him. So we kind of get locked into this movement where we have the angel kind of inviting us in by looking at us, pointing at John the Baptist, which just brings us back to Jesus, which goes back to John, and then this line of the arm to Mary leading up back to her eyes, to her gaze, and that gaze looks back down to Jesus, where the hand is also looking down, which then intersects the angel pointing back at John the Baptist and Jesus looking back at. So we get caught in this cycle, just moving around the figures on here. But there's also a little bit of like an escape from this, right, with all the rocks and everything above it. So it allows us to spiral out from the central composition, explore the whole thing. But because of the brightness of the angel's cape and this little bit of like white fabric, which is then contrasting against this green-blue background of Mary's clothing, brings us back into the central composition, right? And so we kind of spiral out to the muted tones, the background. We're exploring the landscape, but this brightness of the cape brings us right back into this cycle of implied lines between the figures. Da Vinci, was a master for a reason. The guy knew how to create a composition and how to communicate. Yeah. So now we have directional or leading lines. So artists will use lines to direct the viewer's gaze to specific areas of the work or to guide them through a composition. So we've kind of already seen this with the implied line. This is one of my all-time favorite artists. We saw another work, The Monk by the Sea by Caspar David Friedrich. But this one's really great. And so without getting into the history of the painting, we can see how the lines of the painting are bringing us around, but we also see this crashed ship, this ship that has been caught in the sea of ice and crushed because of this line of the yellow ice moving up to the right, and we see this object and it moves us back up to the peak of this ice, right? And this triangle then drops us back down to the left of the painting where we have this yellow line once again. So we just get caught in this cycle of moving around, and eventually we see investigate the background, investigate the midground, and then we come back to this center of action. So, the crushed ship, even though this is the narrative, the human drama of the composition, that's not really the focal point, right? It's part of the narrative. It is nature, the vastness, the supreme power of nature, which is really the subject matter of this piece. So Goya's 3rd of May, we talked about this a little with the lithograph, and so this was when Napoleon was invaded Spain, and French troops just started murdering all the civilians. It was an atrocity. And Goya witnessed this happening, and it had a profound psychological impact on him. So there's a lot of these very dramatic paintings that came out of this time. And Goya was also, a master of the craft. And so when we look through this painting, the bright shirt, the central figure, which is also a Christ-like figure, we can see signs of the stigmata on his hands, which are upraised, but being the brightest point in the image, it is the thing that grabs our attention first, right? And because of this outstretched arm, the figure's left arm, right? This leads us to this building in the background. And then the lines, the horizontal lines moving across, we can go up and up the spire and across this building. And this leads us to these repeating forms of the heads of the soldiers, their hats, right? And we kind of follow this bump, 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 this rhythm moving down the line of soldiers, ending on their rifles, right? And the rifles then bring us right back to the center of the composition, but slightly lower, and kind of direct us to the forms surrounding the central figure. We've already seen the central figure, so now we're kind of exploring the surroundings. And from there, that leads us to the left side of the painting, which is, another line, right? So we move up that left side of the painting and we find this hill. Oh, just hitting my microphone. So we find this hill. And the hill leads us back through the mass of the soldiers, but now we flow through the soldiers down to their feet, right? Since that angle is kind of mirroring what's going on with the hill. And along the way, we kind of pass through this like mass of figures that was there in the middle of the composition, kind of by above the rifles, by the soldiers' hats. And when I first see this, I don't even see that there's maybe an angry mob there in the background. There's some kind of drama, maybe people running towards, running away. We don't know. But that then leads us down to the soldiers' feet, right? And then right by the feet, there's this dark shadow, which is then moving to the left, which then brings us around back to the left side, from the right side to the left side of the composition. And that's where we then encounter the red, and we see these dead bodies, right? And this red then leads us back through the yellow of the central figure to right where we started in the painting. So we're just again caught in this cycle. Where we don't have to, read left to right our eye through the page. Like the artist is guiding us through it, and we can go around as many times as we want and pick out new and interesting details every single time, unfolding the human drama and trying to understand the story and the emotions that Goya is trying to convey to us throughout the process. So again, there's not really like lines in this. I mean, the most deliberate lines are those ones that are in the castle in the back, the building in the back, and those of the soldiers' rifles, right? But in a way, it's also all lines. So yeah, again, line. It's like so simple that it's complicated. Yeah. So here we go. Just taking a minute to look at the composition itself. And of course, there's some aspects of this composition that weren't in my explanation of it. That was kind of a general overview of the 3rd of May. So, all right, now we are on to communicative and expressive lines. So this is kind of a fun one. I can't remember if I actually had one of those little sheets, a little breakdown of the emotional content of lines. But there's just some simple vocabulary here. So it's just horizontal lines tend to be quiet, calm. They convey distance and passivity. Vertical lines communicate height, balance, support, strength, and energy. It's upward, it's active, it's airplanes. Oh, hey, I should have turned my phone off before I did this. All right. Taking care of that really quick, of course. That would happen while I'm trying to record this lecture. And yes, there we go. Moving right along. Curved lines. These tend to be more comfortable, elegant, graceful, and easy. Zigzags. These are anxious. They convey confusion, energy, and excitement. Parallel lines, speed, movement. This, again, is like what we saw in that earlier print. The horizontal lines in the background showing the movement. And again, you see it in anime and cartoons all the time. These lines, movement lines, pop up in the back. And if you want to show something running, you just throw lines on the side of it. It's a pretty common technique in illustration and cartoons and stuff like that. And so then diagonal lines, similar to zigzags. Zigzags I tend to be more angst ridden, I guess, whereas diagonal lines are action. Their emphasis and their change, right? They're neither vertical or horizontal. It's a little bit of both. And especially if you use a diagonal to cut across horizontal lines or vertical lines, you're showing change. So here we go. Like Pete Mondrian, this is the guy that did all the geometric lines, the verticals and horizontal lines. He started with just trees, right? It was trees, the deconstruction of the tree form that led to his breakthrough in abstraction and non-objective art. So he's not trying to give you a tree, right? He is giving you emotions through the vehicle, the representational vehicle of a tree, right? So we can see the technique, we can see the brushstroke. There's a lot of movement and energy in here. And it's all conveyed through this line work, the stacking of lines in the gray space in between the tree, but then the branches itself, it's almost a web work. There's a lot of changing rhythm through these lower branches in the trees where there's a little bit more, and then they get spaced out moving upwards. Everything's at a diagonal to one another, except for these kind of vertical strokes and horizontal strokes that populate the white and gray space, which is supposed to be in the background, but we can tell looking at the image is actually on top of the tree. So we get this wonderful push and pull. It's somewhat of a central, bilaterally symmetrical composition in that the left and right sides mirror one another across the center line, and yet it doesn't feel stagnant in any way. We're slightly off to the right. Remember, like I said, like most artists, they'll take that rule of thirds or the golden ratio, and in this case, a line right down the middle, and they'll just move it slightly off to the side. And sometimes that's all you need to create an interesting composition. So really, really cool piece. This, for being very simple, is one of the most energetic and dynamic works I've seen. As much as I love Mondrian's later non-objective work, these trees are some of the coolest paintings I've seen. And again, here, Da Vinci, the master, is using line, right? This is just gouache. And we have like every different style of line here, right? So for the hair, like we feel the movement, the drape, and it's just like a couple lines, right? Like there's not much. Just a couple expressive lines to give the hair, but then the face is detailed and worked out. It's the same material, almost the same technique for each one, but we kind of slow down on the face. We take our time in that detail, and that is wonderfully contrast with just the gesture of the hair and the figure's shoulder. It's really good. So, yeah, it's the contrast between these two things. And something to keep in mind looking at representational art is typically you'll find more detail in the face and the hands, and the rest can be really wild and expressive and only suggest a body or clothing and movement, and it'll kind of dissolve in the background. But the face will be very detailed and the hands will be very detailed, and typically your eye will slow down when it finds more detail. And so this gives you that variety in a composition, and it changes the rhythm and the repetition and the pattern of it. So it's probably because I just gave the lecture on emphasis and movement and repetition and rhythm yesterday. I'm still got those principles on my mind, but they're there in every work of art. And for me, it's kind of the musicality of a piece that's really important. So anyways, yes, this piece feels soft, calm. And that's kind of contrast with a Van Gogh, right? Where this is his room at the insane asylum, which was actually one of the happiest times in his life. So he was able to just live and work and paint, right? No expectations. So hence the color palette's kind of bright, right? And yet this is just a room. But the way Van Gogh paints it brings it to life. The movement of the lines on the floor and the bed, pillows, the wall, everything comes to life. This is not a stagnant painting. And even the fact that there's really no shading underneath the bed, the chairs, or the table makes them float and contrast with these lines below them, right? So it's as if everything is floating in this imagined space. Nothing is grounded, which then allows the energy of these lines underneath them to really move, right? Um, so yeah, it's there's a lot of emotion in the line work in this, which then contrasts to the rigorous logic and rationality in this Sol LeWitt work. And when I was reviewing this earlier, it's kind of interesting to even consider these works line, right? Because they're all form created by line. If anybody's messed with Photoshop, it's like you've put the lines down and you use your little paint bucket and filled them in. But that's what happens, right? If you connect enough lines, they become planes, they become two-dimensional. And then if you start contrasting, putting things next to each other, adding shading, then they become three-dimensional. And it's just wild how a line painting very quickly becomes three-dimensional form. The suggestion of three-dimensional form, I should say. Yes, all right. And this is just one of my faves. Again, I've shown you some El Lissitzky. We're going to have a couple here. But it just really blows me away that with a simple kind of architectural sketch like this, El Lissitzky and the artists in his circle, suprematism and constructivism, they draw on this expressive power of lines to create these abstract and non-objective works that embodied their vision of the future, right? This was an ideal, utopic future. And so with no reference to the objective world, they give us a sense of a better life, a better future for everyone, a scientific utopia, their dream of the coming era. And what's so wild to me is that this visual vocabulary that they cultivated still feels very energetic, very relevant, but also very futuristic still today, over a century later, right? So looking at this and this painting, like I get the sense like it still feels like science fiction, right? And this is just like muted tones, like three-dimensional and two-dimensional forms floating in space. And yet I'm seeing space stations and spaceships and the fundamental underlying geometry of existence itself. Like there's something absolutely profound about this work and this one, which we've already discussed. One of the things we didn't talk about in this one, which of course might not have been intentional, might have been, but there's the texture on the canvas, right? Which is providing organic lines, like actual natural lines, which are contrasting with the hard edge geometry, these inorganic lines of the forms themselves. And of course, the circle in the background being a great example of how even something curvilinear, right, can be inorganic, right? Because we don't actually experience real circles in reality, right? They're always manufactured. Maybe spirals, but it's very rare to find a circle in nature other than the sun. But then we can't look at the sun. I guess the moon, but we always, a full moon's kind of a rare thing. And it's still celestial then, so it's not earthly. Anyways, apparently I still can go on tangents even when I'm recording stuff. Yes, okay, so this is what I had mentioned earlier. Here is a diagram of the relationship of line to emotion, right? So it's just simplification. This is a great thing to explore in your compositions in class. We are going to be doing some contour line stuff, but I'll let the sub know that really I just kind of want y'all to play with lines. Grab some rulers, find random stuff in the room to trace. I do not care. I just want you to play and try to use some of the vocabulary that we've been exploring in class to describe and inform your works. All right. So to conclude this, we're going to look at calligraphy, right? Calligraphy means beautiful writing, and it's based almost exclusively on the emotive and expressive nature of line, right? So the character of a line has two functions. First, we have the written symbol itself, which has a meaning, right? You write a word, word means something. But then the manner in which the figure is created provides another layer of meaning and symbolism for this, right? So that's one of the cool things with calligraphy is like the word itself means something, but then the way that you write the word means something. So we can have these complement or contrast with one another. And I would not be opposed to someone for their, in-class project exploring calligraphy. Why not? So here we have a tugra, which is the calligraphic signature of a sultan. And so the refined text of Arabic calligraphy is renowned for its expressive beauty. And also Asian script is known for the same thing. Chinese calligraphy work is amazing. So yes, in many cultures, the beauty of the script is just as important as the message the script contains. A friend of mine was telling me about how a lot of Muslims will recite passages from the Quran without even knowing the language, right? I guess it would be similar to a lot of like Christians reciting, like if we were taking passages from the Old Testament in the original Aramaic or ancient Greek, right, which is what it was originally written in. A lot of people don't know that, but then just reciting it is an act of worship. And so then you think of like scriptoria, again, kind of moving into the Western vernacular context. People just writing the words of the Bible over and over, being an act of devotion, right? And so, even though the world being what it is right now, there is tension between Islam and Christianity historically. These religions are very closely related, right? Like the Quran is talking about Moses and Abraham and the characters of the Old Testament. It's not a different set of characters. It was a continuation of the story. It's kind of like when people don't like the sequel to a story and they want the original, but then some people like the sequels. So anyways, not to get into a big debate about it, but sometimes it is just the act of writing and the care with which you write something that becomes a sign of respect or devotion, right? So yeah, just calligraphy can be part of this project. So, all right, just to wrap everything up, we're going to come back to this image, right? Because we kind of have everything going on here. Contour lines are lines that define shapes and they mark the outlines. Yeah, you can do a contour line project. It's very simple. Lines in the same painting are also used to provide shadows, right? And the lack of them then gives a highlight, right? So this is hatching, and then if you do it in overlapping, you get cross hatching, right? If one's a vertical and one's a horizontal, you get cross hatching, right? Yes, that's what this is. Closely spaced lines are hatching, and this implies shadows. And even though this is a completely flat piece of paper, it gives us a sense of three-dimensionality, right? So this also has organic and inorganic lines. So when we're looking at the horse's manes, tails, the figure's hair, the bodies themselves, the clouds, all of these are organic lines. But this is then contrasted with the horizontal movement lines in the background, giving that sense of drama and motion for the horses. But then in the top left, you also have these rays of light coming down. And these are like the rays from God, right? And those are inorganic in that, it's beyond the material world, right? So this artist has used that, and it's also diagonal, and it's cutting across everything, and there's not really any other diagonal lines. So just in the use of line work in this, we have expressions of the divine. We have movement of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. We've got angels, like everything's going on in this. And this is like a woodcut print. So, the artist is limited, very, very limited in this style of art to only using lines. Like, you can't use shading. You can only create value, shades, right, by putting lines closer together. So Albrecht Dürer was one of the masters. All right. So yeah, that's going to conclude everything for this lecture, and I hope everybody has a great time with the in class project while I'm out of town, and I'll see you week after next.